December 9, 1945. General George S. Patton, the most famous American general of World War II, dies in a hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. The official story: he was paralyzed in a car accident 12 days earlier and succumbed to his injuries. A tragic end to a legendary military career. But the circumstances are suspicious. The accident happened on a quiet road with minimal traffic. Patton's vehicle was hit by an army truck that appeared from nowhere. Patton was the only person seriously injured, even though others in the car walked away fine. The truck driver was never properly identified. The accident report disappeared from Army records, and Patton died just days before he was scheduled to return to America, where he planned to speak publicly about what he discovered in Europe. What had Patton discovered? The truth about Roosevelt's deals with Stalin. The secret agreements that had handed Eastern Europe to the Soviets. The deliberate decision to let the Red Army capture Berlin and most of Central Europe when American forces could have gotten there first, and most explosively evidence that some American officials had actively helped the Soviets gain territory and power. Patton was ready to talk. He'd been meeting with journalists. He'd been writing a memoir. He'd been openly criticizing the Truman administration's policy toward the Soviet Union. And then suddenly he was dead, silenced permanently. Whether by accident or design, we'll probably never know for certain. But what we do know is that Patton had become a massive problem for Harry Truman, and his death solved that problem completely. Today, we're going to explore what Patton knew, why it was so dangerous, and whether Truman really ordered one of America's greatest generals silenced to protect Roosevelt's legacy and cover up the Yalta betrayal. Let's start with Patton. In the final months of World War II, because that's when he started to understand what was really happening. By early 1945, Patton's Third Army was racing across Germany. They were moving fast, crushing German resistance, liberating territory. Patton believed they could reach Berlin before the Soviets. More importantly, he wanted to. Berlin was the prize. Capturing the Nazi capital would be a symbolic victory of enormous importance. More practically, whoever controlled Berlin would control the heart of Germany and have massive influence over post-war Europe. Patton understood this. He wanted American forces to take Berlin, then keep going east, pushing the Soviets back and establishing American military dominance in Central Europe. But in April 1945, Patton received orders to stop. Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower ordered American forces to halt their advance and let the Red Army take Berlin. Patton was furious. His forces were closer to Berlin than the Soviets. He could take the city with relatively light casualties. Why stop now? The official explanation was military. Berlin wasn't strategically important, and the Soviets had earned the right to take it after suffering enormous casualties. The real explanation was political. Roosevelt had already agreed at Yalta that the Soviets would occupy Eastern Germany, including Berlin. Eisenhower was implementing that agreement. Patton didn't know about Yalta yet. He just knew he was being ordered to stop while the Soviets advanced. It made no military sense. Worse, as Patton's army waited, he watched the Red Army commit atrocities across Eastern Europe. Soviet soldiers were raping, looting, and murdering civilians. They were rounding up anyone suspected of opposing communism and shipping them to gulags. They were installing communist governments at gunpoint. Patton started asking questions. Why are we letting the Soviets do this? Why aren't we stopping them? Whose decision was this? He was told these were political decisions made at the highest levels, and generals don't question political decisions. Patton had never been good at staying quiet when he thought something was wrong. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. This gave him direct control over a large part of occupied Germany. It also gave him access to information that would change his entire perspective on the war and post-war settlement. Patton discovered that Roosevelt had made deals with Stalin that essentially gave the Soviets control of Eastern Europe. He learned about the Yalta agreements, which had been kept secret from most American military commanders. He learned that American forces had been deliberately held back to allow Soviet advances. He learned that entire nations had been traded to Stalin like bargaining chips. Patton was appalled. He'd spent years fighting for freedom and democracy. He'd lost soldiers under his command. He told them they were fighting to liberate Europe from tyranny. Now he was learning that their own government had made secret deals to hand half of Europe to a different tyrant. But Patton discovered something even more disturbing. As military governor, he had access to intelligence about Soviet activities in occupied territory. What he learned convinced him that the Soviet Union was preparing for war against the West. The Soviets weren't demobilizing their forces. They were fortifying positions, stockpiling weapons, and positioning troops for offensive operations. Patton became convinced that war with the Soviet Union was inevitable and America should fight it now while the army was still mobilized and in position. Patton started saying this publicly in press conferences and meetings with journalists. He argued that America had defeated the wrong enemy. We should have fought the Soviet Union alongside Germany. He said the Germans were defeated and would have been useful allies against Soviet expansion. Instead, we destroyed Germany and empowered the Soviets, who are a much greater threat to freedom. This was political dynamite. America had just spent 4 years fighting Germany. Americans hated the Nazis. Millions had died defeating Hitler. And here was America's most famous general saying, "We'd fought on the wrong side." The reaction was immediate and furious. Patton tried to clarify. He wasn't defending Nazism. He was saying that the Soviet Union posed a greater long-term threat than Germany had, and that Roosevelt's decision to ally with Stalin instead of finding a way to turn Germany against the Soviets had been a strategic disaster. But the clarifications didn't help. He said, "We fought the wrong enemy," and people heard Nazi sympathizer. Truman was facing enormous political pressure to fire Patton. Liberal Democrats who still revered Roosevelt were outraged that Patton was criticizing Roosevelt's war strategy. Soviet propaganda was using Patton's statements to claim that America was preparing for war. Eisenhower, who was trying to maintain good relations with the Soviets, begged Patton to shut up. Patton refused. There was another problem. Patton was violating the official policy of denazification. American occupation authorities were supposed to remove all former Nazis from positions of authority in Germany. But Patton thought this was idiotic. Most competent German administrators had been Nazi Party members because you couldn't get a government job without joining the party. If you fired everyone who'd been a Nazi, you'd have no one competent left to run things. So Patton kept former Nazis in administrative positions. He argued they were necessary for practical governance. His critics said he was protecting Nazi war criminals. The controversy grew. In September 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command. He was reassigned to lead the 15th Army, essentially a paper command with no real responsibilities. It was a humiliating demotion for America's most successful combat general. Patton was bitter and angry. He felt betrayed by his own government. He'd won the war and was being punished for telling the truth. And he decided he wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. He was going to return to America and tell the American people everything he'd learned about Roosevelt's deals, about Soviet intentions, about the betrayal of Eastern Europe. This terrified the Truman administration. Patton was a national hero. He had credibility that politicians lacked. If he went public with accusations that Roosevelt had sold out Eastern Europe, that Truman was continuing those policies, that America should be preparing for war with the Soviets, could destroy Truman's presidency. Remember, this is late 1945. Truman is already struggling politically. His approval ratings are falling. Republicans are attacking him on multiple fronts. He's trying to manage the transition from war to peace while dealing with strikes, inflation, and shortages. The last thing he needs is George Patton touring America, giving speeches about how Roosevelt betrayed our allies, and Truman is continuing the betrayal. Truman's advisors debated what to do about Patton. Some wanted to court-martial him for insubordination and public criticism of policy. Others worried that would make him a martyr and give him an even bigger platform. Some suggested offering him a position in Washington where he could be controlled. Patton had already made clear he wouldn't accept such an offer. The decision was made to bring Patton home quietly, retire him from the army, and hope he'd fade into obscurity. Patton was scheduled to return to America on December 10, 1945. Before leaving, he planned to do a final inspection tour of his former command area. This is when the accident happened. December 9, 1945. Patton is being driven near Mannheim, Germany. His Cadillac is traveling slowly on a clear day with good visibility. Suddenly, an army truck pulls out from a side road and hits Patton's vehicle. The collision isn't particularly violent. The other passengers are shaken but unhurt. But Patton, sitting in the back seat, is thrown forward and hits his head. His neck is broken. He's paralyzed from the neck down. The circumstances are immediately suspicious. The truck driver claims he didn't see Patton's car, even though it was a large Cadillac with military markings. The truck was traveling at an odd angle that maximized the chance of hitting Patton specifically. Witnesses later said the truck seemed to accelerate into the collision rather than trying to avoid it. Most damningly, the truck driver was allowed to leave the scene and was never properly investigated. His identity remains unclear to this day. Patton was taken to a military hospital in Heidelberg. Initially, doctors thought he might recover, but 12 days later, on December 21, he died. The official cause was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, complications from his paralysis. His body was buried in Luxembourg, not returned to America as originally planned. The accident investigation was perfunctory. Key evidence disappeared. Photographs of the scene vanished from Army files. The accident report was classified and later lost. Witnesses were never properly interviewed. The truck driver was never identified or prosecuted. For an accident involving America's most famous general, the investigation was remarkably inadequate. Was it murder? We can't prove it, but the suspicious circumstances have fueled speculation for decades. The timing was incredibly convenient for the Truman administration. Patton was about to return home and start talking. Then suddenly he's dead, silenced permanently, unable to reveal what he knew about Roosevelt's deals. Some researchers have suggested the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, was involved. The OSS had worked closely with Soviet intelligence during the war. Some OSS officers were sympathetic to communism or believed cooperation with the Soviets was essential. They would have seen Patton as a threat to that cooperation, and the OSS had the capability to stage an accident that looked innocent. Others have suggested that the accident was genuinely accidental, but Patton was then murdered in the hospital. His death came suddenly after he seemed to be recovering. The medical explanation for his sudden decline doesn't entirely make sense, and the decision to bury him in Europe rather than return his body to America prevented any independent autopsy. We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence has been lost or destroyed. Witnesses are dead. Documents are missing. But what we do know is that Patton's death solved an enormous problem for Truman. With Patton gone, there was no high-profile critic of Roosevelt's Yalta agreements with the credibility to make Americans listen. Other people knew about the deals, but they were politicians or diplomats who could be dismissed as having political agendas. Patton was a military hero who'd won the war. His criticisms would have carried weight that no one else's could match. Patton's death also allowed the Truman administration to control the narrative about Soviet intentions. In late 1945, most Americans still saw the Soviet Union as a wartime ally. Truman was trying to shift public opinion gradually, preparing Americans for the Cold War. But he needed to do it carefully without admitting that Roosevelt had made massive mistakes at Yalta. If Patton had returned to America and started giving speeches about Soviet atrocities, Soviet preparations for war, and Roosevelt's naivety in trusting Stalin, It would have forced a much more rapid and chaotic shift in public opinion. It would have been harder for Truman to manage, and it would have damaged Roosevelt's legacy, which many Democrats still saw as sacred. So Patton's death, whether accidental or not, was politically convenient, suspiciously convenient, and Truman never pushed for a thorough investigation. He accepted the accident explanation, attended to the official mourning, and moved on. The general who knew too much was gone, and the secrets he knew died with him. What exactly did Patton know that was so dangerous? Based on his statements before his death and documents that have since been declassified, we can piece together what he'd discovered. First, Patton knew that Eisenhower had deliberately slowed the American advance to allow the Soviets to reach Berlin first. This wasn't a military decision based on casualties or strategic importance. It was a political decision implementing Roosevelt's Yalta agreements. American soldiers had died in battles that didn't need to be fought because their advance was being deliberately slowed for political reasons. Second, Patton knew that entire regions of Europe had been designated as Soviet zones of occupation before the war even ended. The division of Germany and Austria into occupation zones had been agreed at Yalta. American forces had captured territory that they were then ordered to evacuate and hand over to the Soviets. Patton had personally ordered American troops to withdraw from areas they'd liberated, watching as Soviet forces moved in and immediately began arrests and deportations. Third, Patton had intelligence about Soviet military preparations. He knew the Soviets weren't demobilizing. He knew they were positioning forces offensively. He knew they were developing plans for potential military operations against Western Europe. He believed based on this intelligence that Stalin was preparing for war and that America needed to either confront the Soviets now or accept Soviet domination of Europe. Fourth, Patton had evidence that some American officials were actively helping the Soviets. He discovered that certain OSS officers were providing intelligence to Soviet agents. He learned that some American diplomats were advocating for policies that served Soviet interests. He believed there was communist infiltration, or at least communist sympathy, at high levels of the American government. This last point was particularly explosive. In 1945, accusations of communist infiltration were politically toxic, but not widely believed. McCarthy's anti-communist crusade wouldn't start for several more years. But Patton was making these accusations based on intelligence he'd seen as military governor. If he'd presented that evidence publicly, it would have caused a political earthquake. Truman knew all of this. He knew what Patton had discovered and what Patton planned to say, and he had to decide what to do about it. Could he let Patton return to America and start talking? Could he risk the political fallout? Could he afford to have Roosevelt's Yalta agreements exposed and criticized by America's most famous general? The evidence suggests Truman decided he couldn't. Whether Truman personally ordered Patton silenced, we don't know. Whether anyone in the Truman administration arranged the accident, we can't prove. But we know that Patton's death was extremely convenient for Truman, and we know that the investigation was inadequate and evidence was destroyed. There's another possibility that's rarely discussed. Patton may have been killed by Soviet agents. Stalin would have seen Patton as a threat. Patton was openly advocating for war with the Soviet Union. He was revealing Soviet atrocities and military preparations. He was America's most capable combat commander. And if war came, he'd be the obvious choice to lead American forces. Soviet intelligence had agents throughout occupied Germany. They had the capability to stage an accident. And they had strong motivation to eliminate Patton before he could convince America to take a harder line against Soviet expansion. Stalin had people killed for far less threatening behavior. If Soviet agents did kill Patton, did Truman know about it? Did he tacitly approve? Or did he simply choose not to investigate too thoroughly because Patton's death solved his political problems regardless of who caused it? We'll never have definitive answers to these questions, but we can assess what actually happened. Patton discovered truths about Roosevelt's deals with Stalin that contradicted everything Americans had been told about the war. He was preparing to reveal those truths publicly. Then he died in suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. His death benefited both the Truman administration and the Soviet Union by silencing the most credible critic of post-war policy toward the Soviets. The official story is that it was all a tragic accident. The truck driver didn't see Patton's car. The collision caused injuries that led to Patton's death 12 days later. The possible accidents happen, but the coincidences strain credibility. The timing, the suspicious circumstances, the inadequate investigation, the missing evidence, the convenient outcome for everyone who wanted Patton silenced. Patton himself seemed to suspect something. In his final days, he told visitors he believed someone wanted him dead. He said he'd made too many enemies by telling the truth. He talked about threats he'd received. Some have suggested he knew the accident wasn't an accident, that he realized in those final 12 days that he'd been targeted and there was nothing he could do about it. The tragedy is that Patton was right about almost everything. He was right that the Soviet Union posed a threat to freedom. He was right that Stalin was positioning for conflict with the West. He was right that Roosevelt's Yalta agreements had betrayed millions of people in Eastern Europe. He was right that America needed to take a harder line against Soviet expansion. Within 2 years, Truman would adopt exactly the policies Patton had advocated. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, containment, military buildup, a harder line against the Soviets. Everything Patton had said America needed to do, Truman eventually did. But Truman couldn't afford to have Patton saying it in 1945. It was too soon. Public opinion wasn't ready. The transition from wartime alliance to Cold War confrontation had to be managed carefully. Patton wanted to force the issue immediately, and that threatened to cause political chaos that Truman couldn't control. So whether by accident, by design, or by tacit approval of someone else's design, Patton was silenced. The general who knew too much died before he could tell Americans what he knew. And the Yalta betrayal remained hidden for years longer, long enough for Truman to manage the narrative and shift policy gradually rather than through explosive revelation. George Patton was one of the greatest combat commanders in American history. He was also arrogant, politically tone-deaf, and often said things that were offensive or foolish. But on the question of Soviet intentions and Roosevelt's naivety at Yalta, he was absolutely right. And he died trying to warn America about what he discovered. Whether Truman ordered him silenced, we can't prove. Whether the accident was really an accident, we'll never know for certain. But the timing, the circumstances, and the convenient outcome for everyone who wanted Patton quiet create a pattern that's hard to dismiss as mere coincidence. Sometimes the truth is too dangerous to be told. Sometimes people who know too much become liabilities, and sometimes those people die in accidents that are never properly investigated. That's what happened to George Patton. And Harry Truman, whether he ordered it or simply benefited from it, made sure that the general who knew too much about Roosevelt's deals would never get the chance to tell America what he discovered.